The UK housing market is broken. I'm afraid to start with, I'm going to take you on a detour and begin with a Karl Marx quote. As soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed and demand a rent. Only the thing is, it wasn't Karl Marx that said this, it was actually Adam Smith who pretty famously founded capitalism. His book, The Wealth of Nations, provided the first mention of how one's pursuit of self-interest is the best engine for any economy. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. This, unfortunately, however, has subsequently been bastardised into the notion that greed is good, far from what he was getting at. See, when Adam Smith came up with the concept of the invisible hand, he actually stated that self-interest, only when it is combined with competition, produces optimal outcomes in a market economy. Without competition, he noted, excessive greed results and leads to market failure. His point being that while self-interest motivates economic activity, competition naturally regulates it. The baker bakes out of self-interest because they want to buy the things they need, and selling bread has become their most efficient way of earning money to do this. But it is competition that keeps this baker's self-interest in check. The existence of other self-interested bakers stops this particular baker overcharging for low-quality bread, maximising their own gain to the detriment of their customers. Thereby, competition is just as integral as self-interest in functional capitalism. While excess profits can exist in the short term, these temporary profits attract other self-interested parties to enter the market, meaning excess profits should not be possible in the long term as they are competed away over time. This is straight from the mouth of the founder of economics, yet competition has completely disappeared from the discourse of most capitalists today, glorifying only greed instead, and misappropriating Adam Smith in doing so. Indeed, to offer up one final quote, as distinct from rational self-interest, Adam Smith was most definitely explicitly against excessive greed. All for ourselves and nothing for other people seems, in every age of the world, to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. So, Adam Smith, the godfather of capitalism himself, saw excessive greed as problematic and despised landlordism, given it offers no productive output. And this brings me back, eventually, to the broken UK housing market, where irrational greed and landlordism are two big factors at play, distorting and damaging this marketplace. Worse still, more or less every government policy on housing in the UK has left the market less affordable, rather than more. Help to Buy, including shared ownership, mortgage guarantees, Help to Buy ISAs, as well as 5% deposit requirements when buying new builds, were all policies intended to stimulate demand. These demand-side actions did nothing but sink taxpayer money into further increased house prices, therefore failing entirely and actually hindering people's ability to buy. Stamp duty holidays have similarly done nothing but add to house price inflation. The cynic could identify these as deliberate moves to win votes from people that worship their property prices, despite no one, certainly not the real economy, really benefiting from an inflated housing market. Right to Buy was a scheme introduced by Thatcher in the 1980s. It was reintroduced more recently and reaffirmed by Boris Johnson as recently as June 2022. As the tin says, Right to Buy gave social tenants the right to purchase their homes at significantly subsidised prices, moving a material amount of government housing stock from socially rented to privately owned. Whilst in theory it could boost the supply side of the home ownership market, in reality it has been the largest failed privatisation by the government in history, reducing the government stock of social housing from 6.5 million units in 1979 to roughly 2 million units in 2017. It is estimated that over 500,000 social housing properties originally sold under Right to Buy are now let in the private rental sector. While on the subject of failed government policies, the establishment of buy-to-let mortgages by the Conservative government of 1996 has also been damaging, perhaps the most damaging, to the UK property market. By allowing people who already own homes the ability to borrow to buy more properties, with the sole intention of letting them out to those who almost always own no property, the government have fostered a strange dynamic. Particularly since, according to this survey, 30% of tenancies are owned by landlords who describe themselves as self-employed, as a landlord, and another 30% by landlords describing themselves as retired. This means in at least 60% of tenancies, while the tenant is productively earning money and working in the real economy, they lose almost 1/3 of their gross income, so much more of their post-tax income that they actually receive, to a landlord, that is not actively working or contributing to society. The idea that landlords provide a service seems a little silly when this same tenant could instead be using only 18% of their gross income to pay down their own mortgage and ultimately own this same place that they live in. Instead, it is the landlord's mortgage that is gradually paid off by the tenant, and the difference between the rent and the mortgage payments, on average, is pocketed by the work-shy landlord. The tenant gets no way nearer to home ownership. As if this weren't already a good enough deal, buy-to-let mortgages have actually allowed landlords favourable tax treatment via the ability to offset their mortgage interest payments against their rental income. This means a landlord receiving 15k a year in rent from tenants, but putting 10.8k of this towards their mortgage interest payments, actually only pays tax on the 4.2k difference between these amounts. So assuming a 40% higher tax rate, they only owed $1,680 in tax, an effective tax rate of 11.2%. For the extra 15k in income this higher earner has earned, 40% tax on this should have actually amounted to £6,000. That seems pretty unfair considering that people on normal mortgages, and of course people renting, have no such privileges. Well, the good news is that the government did recently change the policy. Since Section 24 was fully phased in as of April 2020, landlords now receive 20% tax relief on their mortgage interest payments instead. This is less favourable, albeit still a form of tax relief. But the bad news is really that since these changes were announced, buy-to-let landlords all just started up limited companies that would allow them to continue this tax-efficient offsetting of their mortgage costs against the rent that tenants pay them. So, encouraged by favourable tax treatment on offer from the government, private landlordism has boomed within the UK housing market and, crucially, eaten up supply. Meanwhile, low interest rates and the failed demand-side policies of government mentioned above have coincided with this eating up of supply to push up house prices enormously over the years. When people think of supply-side policies in UK housing, the thought is only ever build, build, build. Brand new housing supply is of course positive, but we must not overlook the 8.7 million units of supply now lost to the buy-to-let market. Returning to the survey, we know 43% of landlords owned one rental property, but the 18% of landlords represent almost half of all tenancies, owning at least 5 properties each, meaning the middle 39% of landlords own between 2 and 4 properties.
Applying these percentages, that suggests there are some 460,000 landlords that own some 4 million properties in the UK.
Now, the government were perhaps getting a little wise to this racket of their own making, and in 2015 introduced a higher rate of stamp duty on the purchase of additional properties. Now, I'll come on to this, but stamp duty generally is a poorly designed tax, not least because it disincentivises moving house, since every transaction incurs stamp duty costs, but also because the seller can make hundreds of thousands of pounds in price gains only for the effective tax on that profit to technically get paid by the person buying this house from the seller. But here, the government were already getting my drift and trying to disincentivise people from additional property purchases. However, even these tax thresholds are poorly designed. If I somehow have £1 million to invest in the UK housing market and I already own my own home, the stamp duty tax bill from putting this £1 million into one additional property
is £71,250.
Whereas by splitting this £1 million up into purchases of 4 250-grand properties, the tax bill dropped to only 30k in total. So again, anyone thinking of putting money into the UK housing market is incentivised, thanks to government policy, to spread that amount across multiple houses. 4 in this case, rather than 1. So whatever percentage the UK housing supply was about to drop by, that drop just quadrupled in this case. But no one is thinking there are any real supply-side policies aside from house building that could boost the housing market. Now don't worry, I have more moderate ideas, but of course the most extreme supply-side policy would be a strict limit on the number of homes that any person can own. With 8.7 million of 28.3 million homes being rentals, that's almost 1/3 of the UK's aggregate housing stock. So, in the severest case where people were limited to owning just the one house, the one they occupy, this would see all properties exit the private rental sector, creating a 50% increase in owner-occupied housing. But that's a fairly dictatorial limit to impose, even if it does mirror the principle of good manners when someone is handing out biscuits at a party, the rule that everyone who wants one gets a biscuit before anyone has 2. But of course, in reality, this extreme policy would shut down the rental market entirely. Clearly, there is some need for a rental market, but we need to think much more carefully about how this looks, as I'll come on to. How big does the rental market need to be? Landlords, who perhaps could be biased in their view, like to claim there will always be lots of people who prefer to rent. But according to this survey, nearly 2/3 of private renters, 61%, would like to buy. And over half of the rest of these private tenants, saying otherwise, cite being unable to afford it as their reason for not looking to buy. Of course, forced sales of properties by landlords and the consequent flood of supply available to only those who don't yet own a property could meaningfully reduce house prices. This would increase affordability for such first-time buyers. No bad thing if everyone still gets to live in their same lovely homes. It's only the landlords losing out. And given 60% of current tenancies are operated by landlords who don't actively work, is it not a better outcome for the people that are working to retain more of their income, net of a similar monthly housing cost where that housing cost is actually paying down their own mortgage rather than someone else's? People can still invest as many pounds as they wish into the UK housing market, just into one particular property. Nonetheless, the policy would be an enormously punchy one, so I put it right to the top of my scale of radical. But clearly, discouraging property hoarding by individuals will logically have a positive supply-side impact on the owner-occupiers side of the market. We noted that stamp duty, in its current form, favours investing £1 million into multiple properties, but a simple reconfiguration of stamp duty could be to tax additional properties incrementally, perhaps such that each additional property beyond one's primary residence incurs an additional 5% charge. This would certainly discourage further buying up of the housing supply at least, particularly where owner-occupiers may be having their homes repossessed over the coming months. As banks put these houses to market, this new stamp duty setup could hopefully discourage cash-rich landlords from buying up more of these homes, stripping supply from owner-occupiers. But perhaps this wouldn't necessarily do enough to encourage landlords to relinquish their ownership of buy-to-let properties back to the market. Only if they were buying more properties can stamp duty put them off. Fortunately, rising interest rates are doing a fine job of making buy-to-let landlordism much less viable, meaning that landlords are already selling up when it comes to their buy-to-let properties. The buy-to-let cash cow requires rents in excess of mortgage interest payments, so the landlord can pocket the net amount as cash from the tenant, with the tenant kindly also paying off the landlord's mortgage on this increasingly valuable house. So when rental incomes fall short and landlords have to pay their own mortgages, their property portfolio can suddenly become an enormous drain. Monthly cash inflows become outflows instead, paired with less certainty that the house itself will be worth more than today over the next few years. Buy-to-let landlords therefore argue if they don't receive some form of government support, they will be forced to raise rents and their tenants therefore suffer. And if they can only receive the same rate of rents they originally agreed with their tenants, they may be forced to sell the property because the idea of actually paying their own mortgage is unthinkable. They argue, in either case, that the private rental sector suffers. Clearly this is the case if landlords can successfully pass any costs on to tenants, but if they are unable to do this, for example if they honour existing tenancy contracts or if the government introduces rent controls, then perhaps the outcome really isn't so bad. The landlord claims their forced sale of the buy-to-let property reduces the stock of rental properties, and the reduction in rental supply means rents increase anyway. Now, if we are thinking one-dimensionally, that could be true. Let's assume a fixed number of tenants, i.e. demand, and a reduction in the supply of rental properties. Absolutely, rents could rise. But these houses don't magically disappear as landlords seem to think. If they aren't sold to another landlord within the rental market, they are sold to someone that will buy it to live there. And that could be the previous tenant themselves, given 61% of renters ultimately want to buy a house. Every single property previously held by a landlord that ends up in the hands of someone who did not previously own a house is an uptick in the home ownership rate, home ownership rising being a good thing. So if rent controls can be imposed, perhaps a little radical, this ends up ultimately as a boost to supply for owner-occupying buyers. Landlords sell because buy-to-let is no longer a profitable trade when interest payments exceed rents. For this same reason, other buy-to-let landlords probably won't want to buy because the cash cow has disappeared. So rent controls are another suggestion. These may seem radical, but the argument against them tends to be that they lead to inadequate quality of rental supply. But let's bear in mind the state of play currently. According to review analysis of EHS data, some properties were much more likely to be non-decent compared with the sector average of 27%. That's already 27% of private rental sector housing that's non-decent. And these include converted flats, 52% non-decent, and dwellings constructed before 1919, 47% non-decent. So do we really think landlords will be upping the rents to pay for repairs and refurbishments, or to, as discussed, meet their increased mortgage payments? Some form of rent controls are practiced in many OECD countries other than the UK already. But I have a more novel and interesting policy idea here, replacing the need for more radical rent controls, which no doubt have their flaws. The power imbalance between landlords and their tenants is too great. Since tenants have nowhere else to live, this power allows the landlord to, as per human nature, get greedy, much to Adam Smith's disappointment. Now, the recent Renters Reform Bill has gone some way to redress this power balance, introducing protections from tenants being evicted for no reason, for example. But one simple move that could even up the power dynamic further, whilst also facilitating the transfer of property supply, would be a private sector right to buy policy. That is, all future tenancy agreements must legally always include a right for the tenant to buy the property from their landlord. Much as a football club pays the wages of a loanee player while the parent club retains the ownership of the player, this policy would equate to the additional clause often seen nowadays, whereby this club has a legal right to buy the player from the parent club at the end of the loan contract, usually at a pre-agreed price. But a private sector right to buy policy would mean, following an independent valuation at the outset of the tenancy, the rent paid by the tenants over the course of the contract amounts to the discount at which they are entitled to purchase the property from their landlord. If the pre-agreed price was 100k and the tenants paid 10k rent over 2 years, they can exercise this option and buy the house for 90k. The landlord also loses the right to any of the tenancy deposit in the process, since the property then belongs to the tenant. And this tenancy deposit can therefore at least form some of the basis for the deposit on the house. Not all tenants want to buy, of course, so may not choose to exercise the option. But this simple move hands some legal power across to the tenant. So now, being a private landlord comes with the fair risk of having to sell your property to the person that actually lives there. They're not having their assets stolen from them. They are, of course, receiving the cash value of their property in the process. Plus, a forced sale shouldn't be seen as controversial. The tenant was the one living there in the first place, and it's nowhere near as destabilising as an eviction would be to the tenant. So thinking of the incentives here, this would encourage landlords to reduce the rents they charge tenants, to ensure tenants are entitled to a smaller discount ultimately, should they decide to exercise their purchase option. And landlords also wouldn't really want house prices to continue to spiral upwards, given they would already be fixed to the pre-agreed valuation. Any capital gain occurring during the tenancy is to the benefit of the tenant instead of the landlord. And of course, if landlords don't really like this, well, they could just actually live in the houses themselves. The whole point is that landlordism is not productive. Adam Smith, the capitalist of all capitalists, made this point, and discouraging it is clearly to the benefit of any productive economy. If people not working can be compensated for extracting large amounts of the income of those who are working, we are bound to have low levels of productivity in our economy. Incentives are completely misaligned. And simply taxing undesirable buy-to-let rental incomes at a higher rate than other sources of income would of course be much better than giving landlords all the tax breaks they currently have. But it wouldn't necessarily resolve the power dynamic at play. So increased taxes on landlords could easily be passed on to tenants without other measures in place. We are clearly trying to actively discourage private landlordism. Where landlords have buy-to-let mortgages, and therefore properties must be let out in order to be viable investments, the policies above would be enough to encourage the transfer of supply from the private rental sector back to the owner-occupiers market. But we must be extremely careful in the minority of cases where additional properties are owned outright instead. We do not wish to discourage these people from just leaving these properties empty and unused. Here, heavy taxation of properties left empty or idle could quickly disincentivise these people from leaving their second and third homes empty. Essentially, in the spirit of Adam Smith's competition, use it or lose it. And of course, we don't want to shrink the private rental sector into oblivion. There are people that appreciate its flexibility, though for what it's worth, I would also advocate increasing flexibility of the housing market by replacing all primary residence stamp duty with the removal of the capital gains tax exemption here. People who move 3 times should not be taxed 3 times more than people who move once. But we do need to think very carefully about what the rental sector should look like. Bear in mind that at least 30% of tenants on average have been funding their rent payments from housing benefit. So, removing the tenant as the middleman, 30% of the time, the state is ironically providing government handouts to landlords who, the majority of the time, are not actually actively working themselves. Now could be the time to remind you that 40% of people claiming universal credit, for example, are actually at least in work. But, with almost 1/3 of the private rental sector seeing rents paid to landlords ultimately coming from government handouts, it seems a perverse redistribution of income at least. At this point, if feeling extreme, one could ask questions of whether there should be a partial renationalisation of the private rental sector. The public sector is already carrying 30% of the sector, with meaningfully adverse income redistribution effects in the process. If we were to crudely assume the 61% that are looking to buy rather than rent aren't in this 30%, not an unfair approximation given this 30% will likely be the poorest and least able to buy, that's almost the entire private rental sector accounted for, split into those who use government benefits to pay their rent or those who don't want to be renting anyway. So if the former camp end up in a quasi-nationalised form of the private rental sector, and the latter group end up owning their homes as they wish, then that's a positive outcome all round, and it removes the perverse redistribution of income effect in the 30% group. I know even my softer ideas represent reasonably radical reforms, and all of these suggestions amount to probable political suicide, given they likely create some downward pressure on valuations in the market. All in all, the housing market is worth $9.2 trillion on recent estimates, more than triple the UK economy. If we stand any chance of growing the real economy, we must be prepared for a repricing of the housing market. We need to get money out of the inflated, unproductive housing market and into the productive economy, investing in projects that create jobs and economic prosperity. Rising borrowing rates are already causing this downward pressure on prices, but a more sensible house price equilibrium will result when the financialisation of UK residential real estate is truly rolled back. Housing supply that has been sucked into buy-to-let since 1996 has allowed rentier landlords to profiteer unproductively. And Adam Smith, the daddy of all capitalism, is in staunch agreement with me here. The science of the legislator is necessary to thwart rentiers. Taxation should be used to discourage unproductive economic activities. If this same buy-to-let housing supply can make its way back into the hands of owner-occupiers, everyone is fundamentally better off, except landlords. The UK stands to be infinitely more prosperous when we actually reward hard work and productivity.